Good day, everyone. Our task is to report about the moral universalism and global economic justice. Socioeconomic rights, such as that to a standard of living etiquette for the health and well being of oneself and one's family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, are currently and by far the most frequently unfulfilled human rights. Their widespread underfulfillment also plays a major role in explaining global deficits in civil and political human rights demanding democracy, due process, and the rule of law. Extremely poor people, often physically and mentally stunted, owing to malnutrition in infancy, illiterate owing to lack of schooling, and much preoccupied with their family survival, that cause little harm or benefits to the politicians and bureaucratics who rule them. Such officials therefore pay much less attention to the interests of the poor than to the interests of agents more capable of reciprocation, including foreign governments and companies and tourists. Well, it's not surprisingly perhaps that those who live in protected affluence manage to reconcile themselves morally to such severe poverty and oppression. Still, it is interesting to examine how convincingly they do so. In this regard, earlier generations of European civilization have two noteworthy advantages over ours. First, the advanced industrial societies were then much less affluent in absolute and relative terms. 50 years ago, the eradication of severe poverty worldwide would have required a major shift in a global income distribution, imposing substantial opportunity cost upon the advantaged industrialized society. Today, the required shift would be small and the opportunity cost for the developed country barely noticeable. Second, early generations of European civilization were not committed to moral universalism. The rejection of this idea was forcibly impressed, for instance, when the Anglo-Saxon powers blocked Japan's proposal to include language endorsing racial equality in the Covenant of League of Nations. Today, by contrast, the equal moral status of all human beings is widely accepted in the developed West. These two historical changes makes our acquiescences in severe poverty abroad harder to justify than it would have been in the past. Still, are quite tolerant of the persistence of extensive and severe poverty abroad, even though it would not cost as much as reduce in democratically. So, how will thus this tolerance really fit with our commitment to moral universalism? Moral universalism. A moral conception, such as a conception of social justice, can be said to be universalistic if and only if: first, A, it subjects all persons to the same system of fundamental moral principles. B, these principles assign the same fundamental moral benefits, such as claims, liberties, powers, and immunities, and burdens such as duties and liabilities to all. And these fundamental these fundamental moral benefits and burdens are formulated in general terms so as not to privilege or disadvantage certain person or group arbitrarily. So I cannot fully explicate or explain these three conditions here, but some brief comments are essential. For condition A, allows a universalistic moral conceptions to be compatible with moral rules that hold for some people and not for others. But such differences must be generated pursuant to fundamental principles that hold for all. So generated special moral benefits and burdens can arise in many ways, from contracts or promises, through election or appointment to an office, from country-specific legislation, or from convention prevalent in the certain culture or region, from committing or suffering a crime, from being special rich or needy, from being producing offspring or practicing a certain occupations, and so on and so forth. Only fundamental moral principles, including those pursuant to which special moral benefits and burdens are generated, must be the same for all persons. So these conditions raises that difficult questions of who is to count as a person in the relevant senses. So we can ask, what about the severely mentally disabled infant, or the higher animals, or the artificial or the extraterrestrial intelligence? For condition B, it is arises various problems about how our universalistic moral conception can respond to pragmatic pressures towards allowing the assignment of lesser fundamental moral benefits and burdens to children and to the mentally disabled, and perhaps greater fundamental moral burdens, especially in specially gifted children. No? It is possible that development of feasible universalistic moral conceptions requires that this condition be relaxed somewhat to allow certain departures from equality. No, still equality remains that default. No, the burdens of proof weighs on those favoring specific departures. No, this suffices to disqualifying traditional assignments of unequal fundamental moral benefits and burdens to persons of different sex, skin, color, or ancestry. So moral universalism is clearly incompatible with fundamental principles containing proper names or rigid descriptions of persons or groups. But fundamental principles may legitimately involve other discriminations, as when they enjoin us to respect our parents or to give support to the needy. This distinction between acceptable and unacceptable discrimination cannot be drawn on the basis of formal grammatical criteria, because it is possible to design gimmickly general descriptions that favor particular persons or group arbitrarily. No, this principle meant to discriminate against the Dutch need not to refer them by name, but can refer instead of persons born at special low elevation or something of this kind, similar in other cases. No, if the universalism is not to be robed all content, we must understand condition C, which is including the demand of that moral conception may justify the discrimination enshrined in its fundamental principles. So, from this reflection, we can see that moral universalism cannot be defined formally. So this is why it makes sense to explicate or explain it through an exemplary application to topic economic justice. All three conditions, the ABC, raise substantive questions. Who is to count as a person? Can person differ from one another as much that somewhat a different fundamental principle may hold for them? And when it is distinction made by the fundamental principle arbitrary? These are difficult questions that have more than one possible answer. And even if we could agree on how to answer them, we still would not have achieved moral achievement. From the fact that the rule of helping the needy, for instance, cannot be disqualified in arbitrary, nothing follows about whether this rule is morally valid, or if so, what moral weighs it was. So universalism is thus not a moral position with a clearly defined content, but merely an approach, general schema that can be filled to yield a variety of substantive moral positions. So universalism can be best provide necessarily not sufficient condition for the acceptability of moral conception. So this condition amount to all call of systematic coherence in morality, the moral assessment of persons and their conduct. Of social and state of affairs must be based on the fundamental principles that hold for all persons equally, and any discrimination built in the fundamental principle must be given a plausible rationale. Our moral assessments of national and global economic orders. So let us consider these two important questions about the economic justice. First, what fundamental moral claims do persons have on the global economic order, and what fundamental responsibilities do these claims entail for those who impose it? Next is, what fundamental moral claims do persons have on their national economic order, and what fundamental responsibilities do these claims entails to those who impose it? So The prevailing opinions is that the correct answer to these questions are very different, that moral claims and burdens are far less substantial in the first case than in the second. But this discrepancy in moral assessment, much like preferential concern for well-being of lawyers, looks arbitrary. Why should our moral duties constraining what economic order we may impose upon one another be so different in two cases? So let us consider whether this discrepancy stands in need of justification as moral universalism affirms, and whether such as justification is available. So in discussion of national economic justice, is commonly mentioned that national populations like families may understand themselves as solidaristic or fraternal communities bound together by special ties of fellow feeling. Such ties generate special moral claims and burdens, and our responsibilities towards fellow citizens and family members may then greatly exceed and awaken our responsibilities towards outsiders. No, conceding all this does not, however, invalidate our universalist challenge, but merely gives it different form, involving more specific version of our two questions. First, what moral constraints are there in the kinds of global economic order persons may impose on others even when they have no band or solidarity with them, or a strong band of solidarity with a smaller group such as their own nation? Second, the moral constraints are there in the kinds of national economic order persons may impose on their even when they have no band of solidarity with them and strong band of solidarity with a smaller group such as their own family. So the latter question is not concerned with the more ambitious criteria to which specific society must choose to subject their own economic order, but with a weaker criterion of justice to which we should subject any national economic order, so regardless of how the society in question understands itself. So this weaker criterion is still much stronger than the criterion we apply on a global economic order. There is then a discrepancy between the minimal criteria of economic justice we apply on the global and national levels. So moral universalism demands that this discrepancy be given applicable rationally. So let us first examine, however, whether such as discrepancy is really wide presumed as I claimed. My impression is that most people in the rich countries think of our moral economic order are basically just, although this order does not meet two important minimal requirements we place in national economic order. The first minimal requirement is that, at least within the limits of two justice allows, social rules should be liable to peaceful changes by any large majority of those on whom they are imposed. The global economic order, though, is not stabilized or largely violence-free coordinations of actors. Nonetheless, relies on talent violence in two ways. On the other hand, its stability, like that of any other realistically conceivable economic order, depends on the presence of substantial policy forces that prevent and deter rule violations. So on the other hand, the design of global economic order, in contrast to that of our democratically governed state, is determined by tiny minority of participants whose oligarchic control of the rules ultimately also rest in the huge preponderance of military power. The crucial asymmetry concerning that latter point, we deem it unjust when the national economic order is coercively imposed by a powerful minority and demand that any large majority of its participants should be able to change its rules without the use of force. But few in the wealthy countries place the same moral requirement to the global economic order. Most would dismiss it as ridiculous or absurd. Now, the second minimal requirement is that avoidable life-threatening poverty must be avoided. So insofar as it reasonably possible, an economic order must be shaped to produce an economic distribution such as that its participants can meet their most basic standard needs. So in regards of the global economic order, most citizens of rich countries would reject the minimal as well. So we know that billions abroad are exposed of life-threatening poverty, We think that we would perhaps help these people are sporadic donations, just as we should occasionally support the worst off in our own country. But few of us believe that this extensive and severe poverty is, if it's avoid and even if it avoidable, shows our global economic order to be unjust, no? Some factual background about the global economic order. The moral assessment of an economic order must be responsive to information about three factors. First, the extent of absolute poverty, how severe and widespread it is. Second, the extent of inequality, which is a rough measure of the avoidability of poverty and of the opportunity cost to the privilege of its avoidance. And lastly, the third, the trend of the first two factors, that is, how poverty and inequality tend to develop over time. So, let us summarize the state of our world in regards of these three factors as we continue our reporting.
Let me summarize the state of our world in regard to these three factors. The World Bank estimates that 1.214 out of 5.800 million human beings were in 1998 living below the international poverty line, which currently defines in terms of $32.74 PPP 1993 per month or $1.08 PPP per day. PPP stand for Purchasing Power Parity. So, the income per person per year of people at the international poverty line has much purchasing power as $393 had in the US in 1993. And now, let's proceed to the extent of global inequality. The high-income economies comprising 32 countries plus Hong Kong with 14.9% of world population and 79% of aggregate global income has annual per capita income of $27,510. For the world as a whole, annual per capita income is $55,150 with annual per capita income of about $85. The collective income of the bottom quintile is about $103 billion annually, or the one-third of 1% of aggregate global income. This contrast gives us a sense of how cheaply severe poverty could be avoided. 1/8 of our share is triple there's 140 and should give pause to those who conclude from the very large number of extremely poor people that eradicating world poverty would dramatically impoverish undeveloped countries. Now, the PPP dollar incomes the World Bank ascribed to people in poor countries are on average at least 4 times higher than their actual income at market exchange rates. 1/8, since virtually all the global poor live in such poor countries. We can then estimate that their annual per capita income, $338 PPP 2001, correspond to the most 585 at market exchange rates. On average, the global poor can buy about as much per person per year as can be bought with $338 in a typical rich country, or with $85 in a typical poor one. Global inequality is even greater in regard to property and wealth. Affluent people typically have more wealth than annual income, while the poor normally own significantly less than one annual income. The enormous portions of the super rich in developed societies were given special emphasis in recent human development reports. The world's 200 richest people more than doubled their net worth in the 4 years to 1998. The more than $1 trillion, the assets of the top 3 billionaires are more than the combined GNP of all these developed countries and their 600 million people.
The number of people in poverty has not declined since 1987. since 1996 when 186 governments made the very modest commitment to have the number of undernourished people within 19 years. This number has barely changed, despite a 22% drop in the real wholesale prices of basic foodstuffs. This trend are all the more disturbing as the ranks of the poor and undernourished are continuously thinned by some 50,000 premature deaths daily from poverty-related causes. While poverty and malnutrition are stagnant global inequality and hence the availability of poverty is escalating dramatically. The income gap between the fifth of the world's people living in the richest country and the fifth in the poorest was 74 to 1 in 1997, up from 60 to 1 in 1990 and 30 to 1 in 1960. Earlier, the income gap between the top and bottom countries increasing from 3 to 1 in 1820 to 7 to 1 in 1870 and 11 to 1 in 1913. There is a long-established trend toward ever greater international income inequality, a trend that has certainly not decelerated since the end of the colonial era 40 years ago. Conceptions of national and global economic justice contrasted. The point of the contrast is to pose this challenge. If we consider Subversal's economic order unjust, how can we find the global economic order morally acceptable? Moral universalism demands such a justification. In the face of this demand, we have three options. First, we can evade the demand by surrendering the discrepancy, by strengthening the minimal criterion we apply to the global economic order and/or by weakening the minimal criterion we apply to any national economic order. Perhaps even reversing our opinion that Subversal's economic order is unjust. Second, we can try to meet the demand by defending a discrepancy of minimal criteria, by justifying the view that our global economic order may not be unjust even if it fails to meet the minimal criterion of justice we apply to any national economic order. Third, we can insist on a discrepancy of minimal criteria while rejecting the universalist demand to justify this discrepancy. Responses of the first two kinds accept the universalist challenge and are willing to engage in the debate about minimal criteria of national and global economic justice. The third response declines to join this debate with the tripartite claim that national economic regimes are subject to some minimal criterion of justice, that the global economic order is not subject to this criterion, and that no justification can or need be given for this discrepancy. Section 4.5 focuses on this third most antagonistic response. Moral universalism and David Miller's contextualization. Our discrepant criteria of national and global economic justice are fixed points that any philosophical account of our morality must reaffirm. David Miller may appear to develop such a more sophisticated position, arguing for the anti-universalist claim that we should allow diverse moral principles to hold in different contexts without demanding any justification for such diversity. Miller may appear to embrace the general statement of the anti-universalist response when he associates the contextualism he favors. A species of intuitionism enrolls things with bold, conversation-stopping pronouncement of the form. Equality is simply the appropriate principle to use in circumstances.
Contextualism and moral universalism and John Rawls' moral conception. Rawls' theory commits him to certain moral demands on the political conduct of citizens. They must support and promote a just basic structure. According to Gerald Cohen and Liam Murphy, a monistic universalist, that any fundamental moral principle that applies to social institutions must also apply to personal conduct. But if the difference principle requires that a society's economic order should erase any socio-economic inequality, does not optimize the lowest economic position, then individuals must also be required in their personal conduct to erase any socio-economic inequality, does not optimize the lowest economic position. reason for limiting the range of his principles of justice to the basic structure. Invoking inter alia the fact of pluralism as well as the need to avoid over-demandingness and to achieve stability or compliance. Show that basic social institutions should be treated as a separate context to which distinct moral principles apply. Distinct level of failure. 1. Rawls strongly rejects the difference principle as a requirement of global justice on the ground that it is unacceptable for one people to bear certain costs of decision made by other. Second, he fails to explain why those grounds should not analogously disqualify the difference principles for national societies as well, why it is not likewise unacceptable for one province, township, or family to bear such costs of decision made by other. Third, and if, despite such sharing of costs, the difference principle is the most reasonable one for us to advocate in regard to the domestic economic order, why it is not also the most reasonable one for us to advocate in regard to the global economic order. And the last one, he takes his principle or self-contained and closed system to be acceptable, an ideal for the US even though the society diverged from that task description by not being a self-contained closed system. So why would the difference principle be unacceptable for the world at last which fits the task description precisely?
Rationalizing divergent moral assessment through a double standard. To justify the desired asymmetry, one must discuss the relevant reasons. One must show that some reasons for a strong criterion have more weight in the balance concerning national than they have in the balance concerning global economic justice, and or conversely that some reasons for a weak criterion have less weight in the balance concerning national than they have in the balance concerning global economic justice. Arguments for a weak criterion, economic justice, typically appeal to cultural diversity or to the autonomy of a special ties within smaller groups. Such arguments are often used to justify acquiescence in a global economic order that engenders great poverty and inequality. We can try to alleviate world poverty through development assistance, given ad hoc by affluent societies and individuals or built into the global orders as in the Tobin tax proposal. Some poor countries manage to give themselves reasonable political institutions, but many others fail or do not even try. The global economic does not also play a substantial causal role by shaping how the culture of each poor country evolves and by influencing how a poor country's history, culture, and natural environment. It affects the development of its domestic institutional order, ruling elite, economic growth, and income distribution. The causal role of global institutions in the persistence of severe poverty. The power to effect legally valid transfers ownership rights in such resources. A group that overpowers the guards and take controls a warehouse may be able to give some the merchandise to others, accepting money in exchange. The international resource privilege, then, is the legal power to confer globally valid ownership rights in the country's resources, provides powerful incentives towards coup attempts and civil wars in the resource-rich countries. The international borrowing privilege, according to which any group holding governmental power and national territory, no matter how it acquired or exercised this power, is entitled to borrow funds in the name of the whole society. The international borrowing privilege has three important negative effects on the corruption and poverty problems in the poor countries. First, it puts a country's full credit at the disposal, even the most loathsome rulers who took power in a coup and maintain it through violence and repression. Such rulers can then borrow more money and can do so more cheaply than they could do if they are alone rather than the entire country and were obliged to repay. Second, indifferent to how governmental power is acquired, the international borrowing privilege strengthens incentives toward coup attempts and civil war. Third, when the yoke of dictatorship can be thrown off, the international borrowing privilege saddles the country with the often huge debts of the former oppressors. Continuing to our conclusion, Section 4.9 has shown what is obvious to people in the poor marginal countries, that the rules structuring the world economy have a profound impact on the global economic distribution, just as the economic order of a national society has a profound impact on its domestic economic distributions. If the empirical rationalization fails, if national and global economic regimes are comparable in their workings and impact, then we are, after all, employing a double standard when we count avoidable extremes of poverty and inequality against national economic regimes only. Without a plausible rationale, our discrepant assessments constitute covert arbitrary discrimination in favor of the wealthy societies and against the global poor.